Good evening. A soft, reluctant sun hangs over North Oxford, and in the quiet cafe corners of the Randolph, the day begins not with noise but with a question. A local academic, Professor Gerald Kerslake, has been found dead at Quenby Hall. A bathroom fall, they say, though the mirror was wiped clean. Accidents rarely leave such deliberate traces. But before we follow Inspector Morse into those rain-soaked corridors of Oxford, let me ask you, where are you listening from tonight? Your town, your street, perhaps even your own quiet kitchen. Could a story like this unfold there too? Let's begin. A soft, reluctant sun hangs over North Oxford as I sip tepid coffee at the Randolph, the kind of morning drink that forgets it was once hot, like a conversation abandoned midway. The rain, which had promised violence in the early hours, has settled now into something gentler, half-hearted, more a mist than a downpour. Through the tall windows, it refracts against the panes with the delicacy of old grief, each droplet distorting the view just enough to make memory look like invention. I suppose I was waiting for nothing in particular, a habit, like so many of mine, dressed up as purpose. The kind of morning that arrives bearing no questions, and so one sits still until a question appears. It did eventually, though not in the way the newspapers like to think. The Times, creased in quarters, slumped beside the saucer. I had no real interest in the headlines. The minister's affair, the opera house's renovation, the football scandal in Turin. But the smaller pieces, the ones buried beneath advertisements for overcoat tailors and minor auction houses, those still held their quiet traps. Tragedy at Quenby Hall, local academic found dead in bathroom fall. It didn't catch me right away. Not in the way some names do. Old ghosts disguised as syllables. Number. This one, Professor Gerald Kerslake, meant very little on first reading. A medievalist, it said, visiting fellow at some retreat near Brill. Death deemed accidental. Bathroom door locked, water running. The kind of death people rarely weep over in great numbers, but one that leaves the floor cold and the air oddly still. I folded the clipping and placed it back in the crease. Not yet, I thought. Not today. My attention turned, I won't say drifted, as that implies less precision than I allow myself, to the woman 2 tables over. Late 30s, perhaps early 40s. A fountain pen of absurd elegance. I recognized the brand from a museum catalogue once. Moved across a ream of proofs, her fingers long and unvarnished. She corrected with a surgeon's decisiveness, not a student's hesitation. A woman of lines and margins. Her coat was damp, though she had taken it off carefully, arranging it on the chair as if it might bruise. I watched her rewrite a single sentence 3 times. There was something oddly reverent about it. Her method of revising thought, as if the ink carried too much weight to be allowed a second chance lightly. She seemed the sort who might have known Kerslake, perhaps even detested him. Academics don't always hate their enemies. Often they footnote them instead. Outside, a hearse rolled down Beaumont Street with the slow inevitability of winter. No sirens, no headlights, no visible grief. Just the silent declaration that someone had made their final point and left it there. I noticed then, on the edge of the napkin tray, a crossword left unfinished by some earlier guest. Someone had attempted it in pencil. A cowardly choice, in my opinion. A 5-letter word. A face that sees backward. I wrote mirror in the blank spaces, though I wasn't certain. I just liked the shape of it. Mirror. Reflection. Kerslake a bathroom. Steam on the glass. I sighed, not quite knowing why. It was the sort of sigh that comes not from fatigue, but from recognition. The feeling that something has already begun before one has agreed to begin it. Somewhere behind the newsprint and the chill of the window, I felt the shift. Not a summons, but a soft tap on the shoulder. Lewis would call soon. He always did when I wanted him to wait. But for now, I sat still, watching the woman rewrite her sentence once more. This time striking out the word was and replacing it with became. And somewhere far from here, behind a locked door and a fogged mirror, a man had slipped, or been made to. Quenby Hall stood just past the dying hedgerows, obscured from the road by a row of lindens that looked as though they'd given up growing upright. The car crunched over gravel with the self-consciousness of vehicles that know they don't belong, and Lewis muttered something about the place reminding him of an orphanage once visited on a school trip. The kind that smelled of boiled cabbage and formal disappointment. I didn't reply. He often tried to match memory to place. I preferred to let places speak first. The hall was a manor in the Gothic sense, sharp in its angles but not menacing. It had a way of looking like it was meant to be seen from afar. Up close, it felt unfinished. A converted retreat, they told us, a residency for Oxbridge academics seeking silence, seclusion, perhaps a final book before retirement made them invisible. Inside, it was all cold hallways and unapologetic wood. A clock ticked like it regretted something. No one met us at the door. Eventually, a thin man in a cardigan the color of drowned stone emerged from what looked like a drawing room and introduced himself as Fenn, Aldous Fenn, the retreat's director. He spoke the way some men read Latin, beautifully and to no one. We were late, of course. The death had occurred 2 days earlier. The coroner, with admirable efficiency, had already signed it off. Accidental fall, most likely. Gerald Kerslake. A name that didn't so much stir memory as suggest it should. Lewis had skimmed the file on the way over. A medievalist, of good standing, visiting the hall for a month-long research sabbatical. He'd written something definitive about mirrors in Chaucer, or perhaps mirrors as Chaucer. I wasn't paying close attention. The dead man was found in the upstairs guest bathroom. Door locked from inside. Water still running. A tragic but not uncommon end for a man alone. Still, something in the phrasing of the report had irritated me. The bathroom door was locked, and the mirror had been wiped clean. Wiped clean. That sort of detail doesn't belong in a death certificate unless someone meant it to. Fenn led us up the creaking staircase with an apologetic gait, as if he feared bruising the wood. The bathroom was at the far end of the corridor, opposite a narrow study filled with closed doors and unopened books. Inside, the air was still damp, though someone had aired the room. The tiles were a soft sea-glass green, the color of dreams just before waking. The taps had been shut off, but a stain remained around the drain like a question left unanswered. I stood in front of the mirror, not out of habit, but necessity. It bore the unmistakable smudge of a palm, dragged across condensation. Not a full swipe, just enough to create a small clearing, a circle about the size of a face. That's what stayed with me. Lewis asked what I was looking for, and I told him. Nothing. But I ran my finger along the tile just beneath the mirror, where a quotation had been painted in careful calligraphy. No man is an island, entire of itself. It trailed off in ellipses, as if the author had forgotten how it ended or hoped we had. The quotation, of course, was wrong. Not egregiously, just wrong enough. Don's line ends with, "Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." But here it had been replaced with something looser, a paraphrase that softened the edges. Each is touched by the loss of another. A sentiment, not a citation. Why misquote a metaphysical poet on bathroom tile? Why at all? Lewis stepped out to speak with the local constable, leaving me with the mirror, the tiles, and the sound of water that wasn't there. I noticed then the faintest crack in the tile beneath the misquote. A fissure, thin as regret. Someone had tried to seal it, poorly. I reached for the sink, not to wash my hands. I never do in places like these, but to feel the cold. The taps were older than the hall's conversion. brass, dull and heavy. I turned one gently, and the water stuttered out like a confession reluctantly made. Then silence again. On the window-sill, a half-finished crossword lay folded beneath a shaving kit. I lifted it, not knowing why. The first clue across. Reflected twice. The self becomes this. 5. I didn't write it in, but the answer lingered all the same. Ghost. There was a time, I think, when I believed people arranged their rooms to be seen, but it is far more common that they are arranged to not be seen, or if they must be, then quickly forgotten. Dr. Beatrice Lane's room was precisely such a space. Spare, practical, devoid of invitation, the kind of room that bore no scent of sleep, as though she occupied it only in theory, like an idea awaiting peer review. A narrow bed, the coverlet pulled taut as parchment. No photographs, no ornaments, just a small desk beneath the window and a chair that looked as though it had never been fully sat in. The exception, and it was not a small one, lay open on the desk, a leather-bound volume, its spine cracked from argument, its margins thick with the fever of handwritten conviction. I recognized the title. Speculum Mysteriorum. Reflections and the Divine in Early Ecclesiastical Writings. A book not often found outside locked cases or arguments between scholars too tired to go home. The chapter she had left open bore a title so elaborate it must have been meant to obscure something. The mirror as portal in medieval liturgy and liturgical space. Beneath it, a cascade of marginalia in her sharp, combative hand. But what drew me was not the scholarship. It was a phrase circled twice and underlined faintly in blue. Not all reflections are harmless. She had annotated it with a brief scrawl that looked like it had been written mid-thought. Kerslake insisted on this metaphor. But why? Why indeed? When I asked her, politely, as I do when I know someone expects otherwise, she told me she had not spoken to Kerslake in nearly 6 years, that their work had diverged, that it was more an erosion than a rupture. She said it with the tone of someone who had practiced the line until it no longer registered as a lie. I did not press. Not yet. She poured tea, though not for me. She needed the ritual, I suppose. Some do. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus and ink. Not the common inky metallic of cheap biros, but the older, denser kind used in fountain pens and ecclesiastical registries. That pairing of scent lingered. The kind that reminded me not of people, but of times in which people had tried very hard to be something they were not. Lewis had stood by the door, awkward as always in the presence of books that didn't contain instructions. When I gestured to the manuscript, he asked if it was hers. Beatrice's smile came then. Brief, not entirely cold. She said it was, in spirit if not in publication. She had contributed research. Kerslake had provided commentary. Once. The book had since gone into a second edition. Her name had not. I asked her about the mirror, whether she'd seen it, whether it meant anything to her. She deflected, with the elegance of someone who knows deflection is more palatable when it wears the face of mild confusion. I said nothing. Instead, I reached down and turned the page, as if by accident. There, more marginalia. A sketch, surprisingly unacademic. A robed figure reaching toward a mirrored surface. The mirror cracked ever so slightly across the drawn face. Lewis asked what it meant. Beatrice replied that not all questions in theology are meant to be answered. As we turned to leave, I paused. On the edge of her desk, barely visible beneath a page of notes, rested a slip of paper, the corner of which showed what looked like the grid of a crossword. I didn't move it. I simply let my eye trace what little was visible. One clue read, "Consequence of clarity, 7. Outside, I lit a cigarette I didn't want. Rain had begun again, soft and obligatory. Lewis asked what I thought of her. I said I didn't know, that she was like a library after hours. All the knowledge still there, but the lights off and the catalogue gone missing. I didn't tell him what stayed with me. Not the notes. Not even the quote. It was the scent. Eucalyptus and ink. The fragrance of something once sacred, now slowly vanishing. Lewis never liked these places. He said so with his shoes, the way he walked through polished corridors, as though half expecting the floor to sneer at his vowels. He tolerated academics the way a dog tolerates thunder, with visible discomfort and a private suspicion that the whole thing was personal. It was late afternoon when he found Theo Bryson in the small anteroom off the library, the sort of space designed for reflection, though rarely used for it. Theo had the look of the clever underfed, all wrists and rhetoric, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had recently won an argument no one else had noticed. Admired Kerslake, yes, at least once. Before admiration started to feel like complicity. He said the man was brilliant, and then, in a lowered voice, that brilliance had curdled. I heard Lewis's voice distantly as I wandered alone through the upper west wing. The hall was generous with its shadows. That day it seemed to breathe with them. The corridors narrowed as they climbed, tapering like thought in retreat. I followed no particular path. My feet have always known how to find unease. Mirrors, too many, hung like portraits in corners where no light reached. Some new, but most older. The kind of foxed glass that no longer returns a face but a suggestion of one. I stopped before a tall one tucked behind a bend in the landing. It had been painted black. Not covered. Not removed. Painted. Thick brushstrokes across the glass, as though whatever lay beneath had once been too clear. I touched it. The surface was dry, but not long dry. Why bother to hide a reflection unless there was something to see? Further down the corridor, I found a brass wall sconce with a bulb flickering like it had second thoughts. Just below it, a framed photograph. The residence, perhaps 3 years prior. Kerslake, unmistakably, at the center. Bryson, far left, leaning just slightly toward the woman beside him. Beatrice Lane, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed somewhere not quite within the frame. I wondered if she'd forgotten the moment or if she'd simply wished to. Back in the library, Lewis briefed me with that odd combination of reluctance and satisfaction he always displayed when he knew he'd found something useful. Theo had mentioned a dispute. Archival theft, he called it. A manuscript, Beatrice's, he implied, that had resurfaced under Kerslake's name, draped in footnotes and misattributed gratitude. Nothing formal, of course. No accusations. Just the slow drowning of reputation in the shallow end of collegial silence. Theo had seen Kerslake 2 nights before his death. A late conversation, heated but not loud. He hadn't seen him since. I nodded. These kinds of stories rarely appear in the official records. They linger instead in forgotten corridors and faculty lounges, passed between the lips of men who wear elbow patches and women who circle sentences without ever striking them through. Before we left, I paused at a side table near the fireplace. A bowl of matchbooks, each from different inns and lecture halls across the country. Kerslake had apparently collected them. I picked one at random, the Stillwater Inn, Ely. On the inside flap, a phone number. Underneath it, in pencil, the name Maggie. Not a name I'd yet heard, not one that quite belonged here. That was the thing. Names tend to echo, especially in small, bright worlds like these. When one does not, it lingers. I slipped the matchbook into my coat and stepped out into the corridor again, where the black-painted mirror remained. Unreadable. Defiant. Lewis asked if I thought Bryson was lying. I said perhaps, but not in the way that mattered. Not yet. We left that wing in silence. Behind us, the mirror kept its silence too. It did not want to be seen, and I, for once, understood. Her name was Esme, though she said it the way some people say Tuesday, like it might rain on it at any moment. The daughter of the housekeeper, which is to say, a girl who had learned to make herself invisible in rooms that would never be hers. Pale, quiet, observant. The kind of child who becomes an adult without anyone noticing the transition. Lewis found her first, sitting in the conservatory, with her knees drawn up and her gaze somewhere between the ivy and the sky. He has a way with young people that I don't. He doesn't overreach. Just lets the silence fill up until something real breaks the surface. She told him, after a time, that she had heard voices. Not the kind that require medication. Real ones. Raised. Late. She hadn't wanted to listen. But listening, she said, was the only kind of inheritance she expected to receive in life. She thought it was Kerslake. And the woman who writes the plays, Margot Channing. The name arrived with its own weather. I found her in the smoking room, though no one called it that anymore. She stood with one arm outstretched toward the fireplace mantel, not touching it, simply holding a position as if posing for a portrait she wasn't sure she wanted commissioned. She was older than the others. Not in years, but in exhaustion. Her voice was smoke made audible. She disliked Kerslake, she said, because he believed memory was a currency that only men could mint. Predatory nostalgia, she called it. A lovely phrase. I made a note of it, not on paper. I rarely do. She spoke as though she'd been waiting for someone to ask the question. Not the question of whether she'd quarreled with him, that was obvious, but whether she'd enjoyed it. She said he was clever and cruel in equal measure, that he admired women the way one admires rare books. From behind glass, with clean hands and only if annotated by someone else. I didn't ask whether she'd loved him. That wasn't the question. Instead, I asked about her play. She exhaled through her nose. Not laughter, but the memory of it. She said it was called The Mirror Behind the Words. I told her it sounded like something he would have hated. She replied that was the point. The play, she explained, was about a woman who finds an old diary in a boarding house, but the diary only appears when she speaks certain lines aloud. The woman becomes convinced that language itself is the key to a hidden room, not metaphorically, but literally. She writes plays to unlock places. Sometimes they open, sometimes they don't. I asked what Kerslake thought of it. She said he accused her of writing riddles in lipstick. I asked where she was the night he died. She said asleep. I asked if anyone could confirm that. She said they shouldn't have to. The cigarette trembled slightly between her fingers. Not fear, not guilt. Something older, like someone remembering too much at once. She gestured vaguely toward the window. Said there had been a storm that night, that the wind had sounded like it was trying to rehearse something. I asked if she meant thunder. She said no. Something quieter, more like stage directions. As I left, she said one more thing. Not to me, precisely. That's the problem with men like Gerald, she said. They mistake silence for an invitation. Back in the hallway, Lewis asked what I thought. I said the play sounded terrible, but the title was nearly perfect. He asked if I believed her. I said belief wasn't the point. I said what interested me was that in her version of the story, the diary only appears when certain words are spoken aloud. Lewis frowned and said he didn't understand. I said neither did I. But I was starting to think Kerslake had spoken the wrong words, or maybe, just once, the right ones. Dinner was served with the hushed solemnity of liturgy. A curried parsnip soup which bore the weight of trying too hard, and a lamb cutlet that had seen better company. I sat alone, not out of intention, but because the others seemed to possess an intuitive choreography that placed them in pairs or threes, like chess pieces with unspoken alliances. I've never minded eating alone. Solitude sharpens the palate and dulls the need for small talk. The newsletter arrived, folded beside the wine glass. A little production they published weekly, the Quenby Quill, I believe it was called. Somewhere between vanity and boredom. Notes on lectures, borrowed aphorisms, occasional birth announcements from academics who'd married too late or too hopefully. I read it without anticipation, scanning names, announcements, a brief update on the hall's boiler repairs. And then, tucked between an essay on Old English verb forms and a call for submissions, a poem. No author credited, though the voice was unmistakable. Kerslake. The meter was his. Tight, bitter, so clipped it felt like it had been edited with shears. But the final line, that lingered. Backward truth seemed falsely forward. 9 letters, I thought. My mind returned, involuntarily, to the crossword I'd glimpsed at the Randolph the morning of his death, a clue that read almost identically. Backward truth seen falsely forward. 9. The answer I hadn't filled in, the one that had hung in the air like a moth without a flame. Reflection? Of course. But what kind of reflection was Kerslake writing about? Not the kind found in mirrors, I suspected, but the kind found in regrets, or worse, the reflection that deceives by pretending to illuminate. I left the dining room with a newsletter folded in my coat and found myself wandering toward the cellar. I don't know what drew me there. The wine, perhaps, or the silence that often clings to places underground. The key hung behind the reception desk in plain sight, a detail which always strikes me as both naive and oddly charming. The cellar smelled of wet cork and history. Dust softened the outlines of every label. The ledger, a battered volume kept on a splintering shelf, recorded the bottles with a librarian's precision. But something was off. A 1973 Saint-Emilion. Fine year, singularly expensive, logged 3 days before the death. No record of its return, and no initials in the withdrawn by column. Just a line, incomplete, as though someone had been interrupted mid-intention. 2 glasses had been rinsed and left drying on a rack nearby. One had a faint red trace at its rim. Lipstick, perhaps, but not red like theatre. Red like habit. Back upstairs, I found Fenn in his office, perched over correspondence that looked too ceremonial to be urgent. He poured me a scotch without being asked, which I took as an act of diplomacy rather than hospitality. He spoke of Kerslake with the careful cadence of a man who knows words can be subpoenaed. Indispensable, he said. Insufferable. And then, after a pause that did more than linger, deeply secretive, he sipped something amber and looked toward the bookshelves, as if memory lived somewhere among the spines. Said Kerslake had the rare gift of making one feel simultaneously admired and irrelevant, that he left wounds shaped like compliments. I asked if he thought Kerslake had enemies. Fenn smiled thinly and said in places like this, admiration often serves as camouflage. That here, murder might be too dramatic a word, but resentment could pass unnoticed for decades. I let that rest between us. Then, before I left, he added something. That once, long ago, Kerslake had written a scathing review of a colleague's translation of The Dream of the Rood. Published it under a pseudonym, but the style was unmistakable. He never denied it, and never apologized. Fenn didn't say whether the colleague had forgiven him, only that the man had taken early retirement, and that when he died, Kerslake had delivered the eulogy. Outside, the wind had risen slightly. It made the corridor mirrors tremble, just enough to suggest a movement, or something behind them. Backward truth, I thought again. Scene falsely forward. 9 letters. Revenge. The letter came folded into fourths, slipped beneath my door without ceremony. No seal, no signature. Just the heavy weight of paper that had once been expensive and now smelled faintly of damp books and withheld breath. I unfolded it at the small desk near the window, where the rain was making slow suggestions against the sill. It began without preamble. No, dear sir, no effort at civility. Just the wound, opened neatly. He stole it, word for word, chapter by chapter. My ideas, my voice, my name erased like margin notes. The prose was clipped, educated, and quietly furious. There were no threats, just the accumulation of detail. A thesis submitted in partial fulfillment of a doctorate, never examined. Kerslake had borrowed it, refined it, published it, under a title not far removed from the original, and then, when questions rose, dismissed them as envy. The student had vanished, figuratively, perhaps literally. The institution had closed ranks. The work had been discredited eventually, but by then it no longer mattered. The worst theft is the one that no one believes happened. There were no dates, no locations, no accusations of physical harm, only the slow certainty that Kerslake's brilliance had been built, in part, on borrowed scaffolding. Theo, Beatrice, or someone not yet named. I folded the letter again, slower this time. It felt less like evidence than confession, and yet it accused. I returned to the bathroom. It was empty now, stripped of incident. The kind of room that, in the aftermath of death, tries very hard to be a room again. But the mirror still held its silence. I had been told, offhandedly, and without expectation of follow-up, that the hall had once served another purpose, during the war. A quiet place for quiet interrogations. Those old country houses were often borrowed for such things. The mirrors weren't decorative then. They were tools. Observation without presence. Seeing without being seen. This one, it turned out, had never been removed. Just painted over. The glass still intact beneath the black veneer. A two-way mirror dulled by time and the need not to remember. I traced my finger along the frame. The wood had been resealed recently, paint over rust. But behind it, the question remained. Who had stood behind it? Who had watched Kerslake, shaving, reciting, pacing? Scholars rehearse their lectures aloud, you see, even when no one's listening, and if someone had listened. A witness is not always innocent. Sometimes they become accomplice by proximity. I studied the room again. The steam, the smear, the misquoted donna, each is touched by the loss of another. A line like that doesn't come from a poet. It comes from guilt, translated. From the corner of the room, a small vent, half covered by plaster. Possibly nothing. Possibly once a passage for sound or air, or the subtle pressure of being watched. I left without touching anything else. Outside, I passed Fenn in the corridor. He looked as though he wanted to say something, but handed me only a receipt. Someone had checked out a copy of the mirror in liturgical thought from the hall's private library. Last week, name scribbled in a hasty hand. Bryson, or at least the first 2 letters looked like his. In my room, I reread the letter. The phrasing struck me. Not the anger, but the style. Scholarly, formal, a hint of Latin cadence in the subordinate clauses. I thought again of the marginalia in Beatrice's book. Her voice was sharper, but people write differently when they grieve. Lewis knocked, said nothing had come back from forensics. I nodded. I asked if he believed in ghosts. He said no, but he believed in guilt. I told him they were often the same thing. He didn't reply, just left the door ajar, like a man who doesn't want to admit he's waiting for someone to walk through it. I sat down and wrote the crossword clue in the notebook I keep for cases that feel personal. Observer who never speaks but never forgets. 7. The answer didn't come, but I had a sense it would. There was a point, brief, flickering, when I was sure it had been her. Not out of certainty, but something more intimate. Recognition, or the illusion of it. Margot Channing had a silence that could be mistaken for guilt, but I've known enough women like her to realize it was something else. Discipline, perhaps, or privacy, practiced so long it had become indistinguishable from secrecy. Her play, The Mirror Behind the Words, still clung to me, its premise too close, its metaphors too sharp. It wasn't that I believed she'd written a confession, only that people often tell the truth when they think they're being clever enough to conceal it. I asked to speak with her again. She was in the music room, not playing, just sitting at the piano with the lid closed, hands resting on the surface as if waiting for it to thaw. I asked why she hadn't told me about the affair. She said she assumed I already knew, that it wasn't relevant. She looked at me then, not with defiance, but fatigue. She said he had a way of making people feel important, just long enough to ruin them. I asked about the night of his death. She repeated her answer. Asleep. No one to confirm it. I asked if she had any record of their conversations. Something about the way she spoke, the precision, the recalled phrases, had struck a chord I couldn't quite name. She said yes. I asked if she'd taken notes. She said no, she'd recorded them. On tape. A habit, she said, left over from early work in radio. She liked the way people spoke when they didn't think it would last. I asked if Kerslake knew. She smiled, a slow and unsentimental curve of the mouth. Said knowing wasn't always the same as minding. I impounded the tapes. She didn't resist. They were neatly labeled, filed by date, voice, and topic. I spent 3 hours listening. Kerslake speaking as if the room admired him. Lectures rehearsed. Jokes refined. A few barbed exchanges with Margot. One long digression on betrayal that felt like it had been practiced in a mirror. But nothing. No threats. No mention of the bathroom. No suggestion of what he feared or who. By midnight, I was less convinced. And then Lewis, with his knack for finding the things I hadn't thought to look for, walked in with a folded newspaper, brittle with age and poorly preserved. A student publication from the 70s, found in the back of the hall's library archive, wedged between outdated course catalogues and a forgotten box of theatre posters. He tapped the page with a pencil. A letter to the editor, sharp and eloquent. It accused Gerald Kerslake, not of plagiarism, but something more insidious. The deliberate misplacement of a manuscript. A young scholar's work disappeared before it could be defended. The tone was furious but precise. It ended with a signature. BLI looked again at the anonymous letter we'd received days earlier. The rhythm of the prose, the controlled fury, same hand. Beatrice Lane, or someone using her name, or someone hiding behind it. The initials alone proved nothing, and yet the accumulation, the weight of echo, it was enough to turn the question on its axis. I thought again of her annotations, her choice of ink, the refusal to confirm hatred outright. Outside, the wind had risen again. The trees at the edge of the hall bent inward, like listeners trying to overhear something private. I wrote a note in my pad, beneath the crossword clue I'd yet to answer. Who watches the scholar? The answer, still unwritten, but closer. I found her in the lounge, reading with the deliberate posture of someone who wants not to be interrupted but expects to be. The fireplace was unlit. Shadows clung to the edges of the chairs as if the furniture had outlived its purpose and was waiting to be removed discreetly. Beatrice looked up when I entered, but not with surprise. She seemed to fold her bookmark more carefully than necessary, before closing the book and resting it on her lap. Her eyes, that peculiar green that feels nearer to grey in poor light, held the absence of alarm, As though whatever might be asked. She had already rehearsed the shape of it. I said very little. She said less. It was only when I asked about the mirror that her fingers tightened around the spine of the book. She confessed with a stillness I've only ever seen in surgeons and women who have had something taken from them they cannot name aloud. Yes, Kerslake had taken her research, not just the scaffolding of it, but the marrow, her ideas, her phrasing, even her mistranslations, her doctoral findings lifted whole and reworded just enough to be unrecognizable to those who weren't looking. She said it had happened years ago. A quiet theft, no outburst, just silence. And silence, when sustained long enough, becomes structure. She never confronted him publicly. That would have been uncivilized, uncollegiate, unwise. But that night, the night he died, she had found herself standing behind the mirror in the old passage meant for observation. It wasn't locked. Nothing ever is, truly, in these old houses. She said she hadn't meant to go there, but once there, she stayed and watched him. He had been speaking aloud, rehearsing, as always, reciting words she had once written in a college room on Merton Lane, when she still believed scholarship could preserve something. He looked into the glass, she said, as if expecting it to answer, and she had felt something rise in her. Not hatred, not vengeance, but something more dangerous. Recognition. She admitted she hated him, but she didn't kill him, and I believed her, not because of her words, because of the gap between them. She handed me the book in her lap. Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, John Donne. A thin ribbon marked the 15th meditation. I read it, the line. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main, the correct line. It was the only copy in the hall, the version misquoted in the bathroom, each as touched by the loss of another, had come not from text, but from memory. Someone had remembered it wrong, and memory is always autobiographical. I thanked her, though I don't think the word mattered. She said nothing in return. Later, I sat in the common room alone, the copy of Donne beside me, the crossword from my notebook half finished. A new clue had appeared in my head, as if unspooled from the quiet. To remember wrongly, with consequence, 10. The word eluded me, but I was starting to suspect the killer wasn't the one with the best motive, just the most broken recollection. It was Lewis, in the end, who saw it. Not in the evidence itself, but in the margin. He has a way of doing that. While I pace hallways and lose myself in the weight of words unsaid, he notices things left ajar. He brought it to me quietly. No satisfaction in his face, just the subdued gravity he wears when something unpleasant has been confirmed. Esme's sketchbook. She'd left it on the windowsill in the conservatory, beside a half-eaten apple and a scrap of poetry written in someone else's hand. She hadn't meant to hide it, nor had she meant to reveal it. Like most things that matter, it had simply been waiting to be noticed. Charcoal. Unmistakable. The sweep of a young hand with too much precision for her age. It showed the outline of a man, thin and hunched, staring into a lit window, the distinctive frosted pane of the guest bathroom. The line work was soft, but the coat was Theo's. The collar pulled high, the shoulders held stiff against a wind that only existed in memory. He had said he was walking. Alone, in the opposite direction. I found him in the upstairs lounge, folding and refolding a lecture draft that would never be delivered. His hands moved too quickly. Guilt always fidgets. I asked him gently. He answered poorly, said he only meant to frighten Kerslake, that he'd found a copy of Beatrice's manuscript in an old file, left it where he knew Kerslake would see it. Tapped on the glass, an echo of the past, a ghost at the window. But something had gone wrong. The door had opened. There were words. Sharp, panicked. He hadn't meant to touch him, just to confront. But Kerslake had slipped. The steam, the tile. He fell, struck his head. Theo had run, locked the door behind him, made it look sealed, then waited for the story to settle like dust. He wasn't crying. There was too much calculation for that, but he wasn't proud either, just hollow. A man whose revenge had turned into an obituary he couldn't quite sign. I didn't speak for some time. Outside, the trees were shedding what remained of their color. The season had shifted while we weren't looking, I told Lewis. He nodded, unsurprised. Sometimes the truth arrives with all the subtlety of weather. Back in my room, I turned again to the crossword I hadn't finished. The clue still sat there, persistent as hunger. To remember wrongly, with consequence. 10. I filled it in without thinking, mistakenly. It wasn't clever, but it was right. I looked out toward the corridor, where the light from the sconces flickered against the black painted mirror. And I thought, not for the first time, that some reflections aren't accidents. They're traps, and sometimes what we see in them is only what we've been trying for years not to become. I left just before dusk, though the hour felt more imagined than real. A soft fog had crept up from the low fields behind Quenby, folding the house into itself. The gravel gave way underfoot with a sound like paper being torn, gently, as if from a letter no longer meant to be sent. No goodbyes. Those are for simpler conclusions. Beatrice stood at the top of the front steps, one hand loosely around a teacup gone cold. She didn't speak, and I didn't expect her to. Her nod, slight, unhurried, was not gratitude, not even farewell. It was something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, of what we both knew now, of what would remain unsaid. The car back to Oxford was slow, the kind of slow that makes you watch things you wouldn't otherwise see. The way trees bend differently in fog, how lamplight seems more ancient when it's blurred. I thought briefly of Kerslake's voice on those tapes, self-assured, theatrical, and already decaying. The sound of a man who believed his brilliance should outlive his cruelty. At the station, I bought a lukewarm tea I didn't drink and stepped on to the last train out. Empty carriage mostly. One other passenger. A woman in grey, asleep beneath a book that had slid down to her lap. I envied her for a moment. The simplicity of that kind of forgetfulness. I reached into my coat and unfolded the student newspaper Lewis had found. Its creases held the stiffness of years. The page felt brittle, like it had been reluctant to be touched again. I read it once more, though I already knew the words. The letter signed B.L., sharp as glass and just as impersonal. What it accused Kerslake of, and what it withheld. All these things, buried and then returned, like bones after frost. In the corner, the crossword remained unfinished. A single blank square, the clue left unanswered, seen clearly only when reversed. 10. I traced my finger across the paper, half smiling at the cruelty of it. Some questions, after all, are more honest than their answers. I filled it in. Reflection. Not for its cleverness, not even for its accuracy, but because it felt correct in the way very few things do. Like a line of poetry misremembered, only to discover it more truthful than the original. The train curved toward Oxford just as the sun gave up for the night. The lights in the distance looked like echoes, not promises, but reminders. Someone once said that Oxford is a city haunted by its own memory. Perhaps that someone was me, or perhaps I only wish it had been.